I think the biggest failure was free trade, which was supported by left-wing parties, right-wing parties. Democrats became big supporters of it. Certainly in retrospect, Clinton's support for NAFTA was a major mistake. It hollowed out the middle classes, and parties became enamored of a certain section of the economy winning out.
That was Ted Smyth, veteran diplomat and C-suite executive. I'm Martin Nutty, and welcome to an Irish Stew check-in episode.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ireland of the Welcomes magazine, celebrating 70 years of Irish history, tradition, culture, and community with outstanding photography and inspired writing. Get Ireland of the Welcomes delivered to your door or give a gift subscription and keep the Irish legacy alive for generations to come. Subscribe today online at irelandofthewelcomes.com.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty with the Irish Stew podcast, and welcome to a catch-up episode with our guest, Ted Smyth. And this is the third time we've had Ted on the podcast, and we're delighted to have him back in light of essentially the recent completion of the midterm elections in the United States, which is going to be one of the major themes that we're going to talk about in the course of this podcast. We're going to cover territory, both American, Northern Ireland, and Western democracies. So with that, Ted, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Martin. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
So I'm just going to kick this off. We're recording this on December 16th. Now, we're going to be releasing this in early January. But last week, the Georgia runoff election, which was essentially the final undecided element in the United States midterm elections, was completed, and Raphael Warnock defeated Herschel Walker. And so that completed the picture. But I'm curious as to what your take on the outcome of the election was. There was a lot of commentary about a red wave on the run into the election. So what's your takeaways at this point?
Well, I was in Dublin right after the election results came out, and the only red wave I saw were the Derry supporters down in Dublin for the soccer final, and they were everywhere. No other red waves manifested themselves. Basically, Martin, the battle to save democracy continues, but this was a massive win for Biden for opposing ballot frauds, and fair play to him. President Biden had one of the best four midterm results in the last 100 years. Voters punished Republican candidates they saw as extreme. And if you remember, before the election, Biden made two big speeches denouncing MAGA Republicans. And many Democrats were nervous that he'd gone too far. But it turned out he was right to name them. And that really worked. And the other part that really worked was the Democrats stepped up their economic message. Yes, they were talking about abortion, which mattered in some states, and they were talking about other issues, but it's still the economy stupid, as James Carville said back under Clinton.
So let me push back a little bit here. And I agree. I think the broader media sphere is basically saying that this was an unexpectedly good outcome for the Democrats. But let's be clear here. The Democrats lost control of the House. And there was an interesting study or an article written in the New York Times in the Upshot by Nate Cohn talking about how the Republicans had basically increased their vote in pretty much every state across the union. Now, one of the interesting things that he pointed out was that in the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona, the Republicans, when they look at their share of the vote in the House portion of the election, exceeded the Democrats' performance. But interestingly, the other side of the equation was in all four of those states, the Democrats won the senatorial races, so in the statewide election. So I thought that was interesting, and I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think a number of thoughts in it. First of all, there was a lot of gerrymandering going on. In the old days, Democrats were best at gerrymandering. Now the Republicans are very good at it. They control so many state houses. They can change the districts. And there are examples of it, large and local. Here in New Hampshire, we won the two, I say we because I'm unashamed Irish Democrat, Irish American Democrat. We won the two congressional seats and we won the Senate seat with Maggie Hassan. But locally, here in our town, very good candidate called Jerry Kinneark for the local assembly. He's a doctor. He lost because his district was changed, a deliberate way to get more Republicans elected. So that was going on a lot. Then there was the dark money from the very conservative elements. $16 billion was spent in this election, and there's really no control of it. And the fear and loathing put out on the advertising against Democrats really had an impact. But notwithstanding all that, in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, the senatorial candidate, Fetterman, flipped a Republican seat to win and won well against candidates supported by Donald Trump. We can come to Trump later on. And there were other examples of, in an extraordinary way, Democrats hanging on in close races, including in Nevada. So voters punished Republican candidates they saw as extreme, whether on abortion or close ties to Trump. So that would be my answer. But let's not forget that Democrats had a net gain of governors, the first time since 1934. And, 60% of voters believe Biden was legitimately elected. So all the time you're up against at least 40% of Americans who are election deniers. And that's a very tough situation to be in. But at the end of the day, the election became a choice between two parties. And that's why the Democrats won, not the usual referendum on the presidential party and how he's doing. So that was quite a significant change.
What is the state of play now post this election of MAGA republicanism and Trump republicanism? And should those two things be treated differently at this point? Is there a separation taking place?
Well, that's very good question. Personally, I'm skeptical that the opposition to Trump will take him out. I remember there was a lot of opposition to him in 2016, and at the end of the day, the right-wing base supported him, and the Republican Party didn't have the guts to oppose that. So let's consider where Rupert Murdoch is on Trump, which is very interesting. Murdoch is 91 years of age. He's older than Biden. He's older than Trump. He's anti-elite. He's low tax. He's defense-heavy conservative. But he's speculating that the sell-by date has come for Trump. And, he had the famous New York Post headline, Trumpty Dumpty. But at the same time, Trump and Fox still make a lot of money for Fox, $3 billion of annual profit. And, I'd say that Murdoch will end up hedging on whether he supports Trump or not. And we'll see if DeSantis can make it. But DeSantis is untested outside Florida, and he just may end up being a bust. And I guess we'll see more in the primaries as they go forward. But so, everybody's looking forward to the presidential election. And then, of course, I don't know if you want me to talk about President Biden and whether he'll run again.
Yeah, I think that's the other obvious question to be asked right now in light of the fact that the midterms were over. It strikes me that President Biden was never going to say or announce what his decision was until at least the midterms are in the rear view mirror. He is now 80 years old. No other sitting president has been that age in the office, and he will be 82 years old by the time the election rolls around. So what's your thinking there?
Well, yes, the skeptics say that Joe Biden has done very well and he should go out on a high. I'm of the view that he's probably the best candidate we have to win again in 2 years' time. He's 80 right now. He'll be 82 when he's running. But at the same time, he's very, very popular and he's very alert and very active. And I can see him using, what was that line that Reagan used against Mondale in 1984? I won't make a political gain out of my opponent's youth and inexperience. particularly if he's running against DeSantis, who is vastly inexperienced. And if he's running against Trump, I think he'd easily beat Trump because of who he is. Joe Biden stands up for decent, honest values. People realize that. He's very relatable. When you talk about faith and fatherland, that's Joe Biden. Talk about Scranton Joe. He beats Wall Street every time. So there's so much going for Joe Biden, and I think his family is supportive. Dr. Biden, she said, seems to be leaning towards it. He seems to be up for it, and I think it would be terrific. And of course, we have a personal bias here. A number of us are on the Irish for Biden committee, and we came out quite strongly for him in the midterms. And here are some of the things that he's actually achieved, the record he can run on. And hopefully there'll be less going forward because the House will vote against anything he's trying to support. But look at the record in his first 2 years. The American Rescue Plan, which child tax credit of $60 a month, the Inflation Reduction Act, to great work on reducing carbon energy. He lowers prescription drug prices, the Chips and Science Act, the PACT Act on burn pits, the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, first major gun safety law passed in 30 years. And then he did bipartisan stuff like the infrastructure law, $1 trillion for repairing bridges, airports, and roads across the country. So it's an extraordinary record for him to run on. And it's not just on social issues, but it's crucially on the economy, on jobs, on the cost of living and how to combat that. Look, Martin, people want politicians to solve their problems. And that's what Joe Biden does. They don't want people like Kevin McCarthy to come out and DeSantis and talk about something else that doesn't solve their problems. They don't want to hear about Hunter Biden. That's going to be a disaster for the Republicans if they go on about that. Personally, there's a lot to be said for Joe Biden being the nominee in 2 years' time for the president of America.
So, as I mentioned up on top, the House come January will be under Republican control. Now, stepping away from your partisan position as a Irish Democrat, what do you foresee for 2023 from the Republican House, and what are the implications?
I feel sorry for Kevin McCarthy because he's got a very, very narrow majority. He's going to have to try and keep the so-called Freedom Caucus under control. And they have a minority of members, but they're very vociferous, they're very loud. And they say they want to spend the entire time having hearings on Hunter Biden. And that's going to be very divisive, considered a waste of time by most Americans. And they'll probably try and impeach President Biden as well. And meanwhile, people just want to have a better standard of living. And there are many major issues to be concerned about right now. And all the polling suggests that people are worried about big business, price gouging, unemployment, recession potentially coming if the Fed continues to tighten. So these are the issues that people would be concerned about. And the other thing to bear in mind is the House could do a lot of things like that, but the Democratic Senate would block any crazy legislation going forward. It won't even require a veto from President Biden.
Yeah, so the interesting thing, I suppose, is we're at the end of the Nancy Pelosi era, and she has dominated House Democratic politics for 20 odd years. New leadership is coming under Hakeem Jeffries, who's from my neck of the woods in Brooklyn. What would your advice be to Mr. Jeffries and the rest of the new Democratic House leadership in terms of setting the stage properly for the upcoming presidential election cycle?
It's a good question. And yes, Hakeem Jeffries, I think, will be a great speaker. But the greatest of all speakers since Tip O'Neill, I would like to say, was Nancy Pelosi, an extraordinary legacy and a great friend of Ireland. We can come to that later on. But I think the Democrats are on a winning ticket with the economy, and they should continue to do that. Recently, the Democratic House passed an anti-price gouging bill with Republican opposition, and they need to talk about price gouging by big business, big pharma. That's 8% inflation. About half of that is due to companies taking advantage of inflation to hike their prices even more. It's clear in the oil, with the price of gas for cars going way beyond the price of oil. So, yeah, the economy is working for them, and they need to keep pushing on that. Yes, abortion concerns some people, but in some states, ironically, where abortion is not under threat, like New York, Democrats lost 4 seats. So that should be an issue. But for swing voters, and those swing voters include Gen Z, millennials, blacks, Latinos, Irish Americans, suburban voters, their question is, what are you going to do for us, especially for the economy? And regardless of what happens in the Republican controlled House, I think the Democrats need to keep up that drumbeat as a minority in the House, although it's a very small minority. Hopefully, they might even get some bipartisan support for something sensible in the House. The Senate would then pass it and Biden would support it. So keep pushing for progress for ordinary people and don't be sidetracked by social issues, Republican allegations, and Biden and sex, gender, all those things. I mean, for Republicans to make an issue out of COVID vaccine just shows you how extreme they can be. And Democrats just need to keep on doing common sense things for Americans.
So I think, just boomerang back to what you said earlier about James Carville, the former advisor to President Clinton, it will continue to be over the next 2 years the economy stupid. It will be, what solutions are you delivering? If you were to put your hat on and say, okay, I'm going to have to advise the Republican Party now, what solutions should they be pushing? In my view, I haven't seen much evidence of any attempt to articulate solutions. What I've seen is mostly an attempt to make people fearful of the border, fearful of social issues, let's call it, be it LGBTQ issues, etc. Can the Republican Party step away? Must they step away? And can they step away?
Good question. It depends on the base. And the Trump controversy will be a big test. Mitt Romney has come out and said that Trump is the kiss of death for anybody trying to win a general election. But will the base believe that? Now, there's some evidence that the base is beginning to lose interest in Trump. Wall Street Journal poll the other day showed over 56% prefer DeSantis to about 30% for Trump, of people who are likely Republican primary voters next time around. And interesting enough, these people say they like Trump's policies, the sort of populist policies, but they don't like Trump at this stage. They feel he's too much of a liability. And of course, he has his various prosecution issues underway. Who knows where that will go? So the populism is a dirty word in some circles, but actually what it means is trying to find solutions for ordinary people, opposing free trade. So if I are the Republicans, I'd double down on that, just as Democrats are. I mean, Joe Biden has walked away from free trade. He's been accused by China of breaking World Trade Organization rules. Well, gosh, free trade isn't free if the Chinese can cheat against American workers. So Republicans will have a good competitor with Democrats in who's for the American worker, who's bringing jobs back, who's looking after working class people, and rather than just offshoring the jobs. So, in a sense, the Republican Party has a problem because its bosses, its financing is coming from people who want to offshore jobs, big business, but its voters are people who are losing out on that equation in rural America. So they'll try and square that circle and been quite good at it up to now by distracting rural voters with issues of guns and anything else they can come up with to distract them. So I guess if they're being honest, though, they'll follow the economic route and try and even do some bipartisan things for America. I think that would help their image a lot. Not having Trump, being bipartisan, if they can possibly get there on a few key issues to do with the economy, and take it from there. It was noticeable, I thought, during the campaign, the midterms, that a lot of Republicans were downplaying abortion. They were saying, oh, I wouldn't be for abortion restrictions in entirety. Democrats are just exaggerating that problem. So they were trying to walk back a bit from the Supreme Court decision and from a lot of extreme talk in states banning abortion in every situation. So they've got a bit of a problem, but their only chance is to go for the middle ground. Any election, whether it's Ireland or the United States, it's all to play for in the middle ground. You might have 40, 40, and 20 in the middle. And you can't win an election unless you win some of those votes.
Just moving away from the American political scene, why don't we cross the Atlantic and talk about Northern Ireland, which I know is a topic that's close to your heart. We talk about stalemate in the United States Congress now that we're looking forward to in the upcoming congressional cycle. But there's another stalemate obviously taking place in the Northern Ireland Assembly. There was an election took place in May of this year. And since then, we haven't been able to form a government due to the major unionist party, the DUP, refusing to participate. How do you see things playing out going forward? We're on to our third prime minister of 2022. Given all those shifts in the landscape, what are we going to expect going forward now?
Well, first of all, it makes no sense to me that unionists would want to boycott the assembly. It's their best defense against United Ireland. And they should be making the assembly work, making Northern Ireland work, and not protesting about the protocol, which is, after all, a wonderful thing for Northern Ireland. The protocol gives business in Northern Ireland access to both the European market and to the British market. And no other entity has that. So it makes no sense to me. Now, their fears were stirred up by British extremists who are very anti-Europe and wanted a row between Britain and Brussels. But they should see their best interests where they are. And Sinn Féin are probably a bit ambivalent because the more frustration they can see in Northern Ireland, the more people might feel, oh, well, we better, it's not working, we better think about a united Ireland. So the standoff isn't good because the peace is tentative in Northern Ireland. Good Friday Agreement is essential. But as we come up to the 25th anniversary in April, and it sure would be great if we could have a celebration, if the Assembly was back in place. And my only hope is that Rishi Sunak, the new British Prime Minister, can see his way to the landing zone for a solution. It's not hard. Green zone, red zone. Brussels makes a few concessions, and he can claim victory. The unionists can claim victory, and the Assembly can work. And that would be a great opportunity to celebrate, and hopefully with President Biden and former President Clinton in attendance.
My attempted reading of the tea leaves when it comes to the number 10 Downing Street's view on the Northern Ireland situation is we've moved from a Boris Johnson administration, which was choosing very cynically to use Northern Ireland as a bargaining chip to try and cut a better trade deal with the European Union. Then the very extraordinarily brief Liz Truss administration. The only thing that I could comment about that interlude was a sense that they were more interested in actually being constructive on the matter. And now it feels to me that Sunak is following on to Liz Truss in that respect. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the situation in Britain, which still seems very cloudy to me. But was your read similar to that?
Well, I think the last thing Britain can afford right now, and any British government have to say that, with inflation raging, with massive strikes in the healthcare system and other strikes threatened, is a trade row with Europe. It just doesn't compute. So all the self-interest, and Britain's been very good at self-interest, would say, let's patch up relations with Europe. It's been fun having an anti-European bias going on, but now we just need to patch that up because you do your biggest trading with your neighbor. For example, the United States' biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. So similarly in Britain, physically, distance does matter. They need to trade with Europe. Number two, Sunak wants to have a good relationship with the United States. It would be a big feather in his cap to get a trade deal with the US, get that underway. It's not going to happen as long as they're threatening the Good Friday Agreement. Both Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate have made that clear. As recently as November, Brian Fitzpatrick, who will become the chair of the Europe subcommittee in the House, said it's in America's national interest and to have peace in Ireland and to have good relationships between Britain and Europe. So, American position on that, in addition to that, of course, support from Joe Biden, is very clear.
What adjustments do you think need to be made to the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, for DUP to walk away and say, yes, we've achieved something meaningful and now we are willing to participate in the assembly?
I think a clear reduction in the bureaucratic requirements for entry and for importing and exporting between Britain and the Northern Ireland ports of entry. And that can be done through a green zone, red zone approach. As you arrive in airports in Europe, you're given the choice to go to the green zone or the red zone. Very seldom is one stopped in the green zone. There are spot checks and so forth. That seems to me to be a landing zone that's fairly apparent to everybody. The British haven't pursued it because they wanted to keep the ideological rift going with Brussels. But if Sunak settles down now and between now and the end of January, I believe he can get it done if the political will is there. And then, unionists can claim victory. The so-called border in the Irish Sea has gone away, and they can move back into the assembly, take credit for that, and then potentially gain some votes in the next election.
The other aspect of this, which we haven't talked about, of course, is that the DUP, the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland, is no longer the largest party in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin in the May election exceeded their vote, meaning the First Minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly would now be Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin. Now, as I understand it, it doesn't really matter too much who is the first and second minister beyond what strikes me as little more than chest thumping. Effectively, from a governance point of view, it doesn't make a darn bit of difference. Would you align with that, or what do you think?
We've seen that in the past when Sinn Féin and DUP shared the job. And frankly, I think it was a mistake by Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP to make an issue out of it because most people wouldn't have noticed who was First Minister. And, it's symbolically important. It was noticeable that when King Charles went to Belfast and met with Sinn Féin and the DUP, he turned to Michelle O'Neill and said, "Oh, you're the largest party now, aren't you?" Right in front of Jeffrey Donaldson. So he was really sort of sticking it in there a bit. This is democracy at work. And we haven't talked about the idea of a united Ireland, what it means, and so forth. But all the polling would suggest in the north that there's about 40% of the population in favor of United Ireland, 40% against, and 20% in the middle from both the Catholic and Protestant background. And that 20% is all to play for by both parties. So it makes no sense to me that the DUP would be playing hardball or that Sinn Féin would be either. Sinn Féin doesn't appear to want to make any concessions to the British identity in considering United Ireland. And the DUP want to make no concessions to the Irish Language Act, to Bill of Rights, and so forth. So maybe at some stage, both parties will wake up and say, we've got to win the middle ground in order to prevail.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting moment because the polling that you referred to, I think, is recent Irish Times polling back in early December. And I noticed, surprisingly to me, that one of the breakout numbers that I saw was that 21% of the Catholic community wanted to stay within the United Kingdom, which I thought was really interesting because the assumption, I suppose, is that these blocs, Catholic and Protestant, or nationalist versus unionist, are monolithic. To what degree do you think that monolithism has been shattered, and has it been shattered by the fact of 25 years of peace and people are less invested in these cultural divides?
Good question. I think there's a secularization of society in general in Ireland, North and South, and what Brendan O'Leary refers to as cultural Catholics and the cultural Protestants, or post Protestants, post Catholics. People are certainly less influenced by one's religion. And there was a part of Ireland too, which was becoming closer together under a shared European identity. And that's being dented and damaged a bit by Brexit because the British government is saying, are you British or are you European? And that's a binary choice that I think is very negative for Northern Ireland, very damaging. So, to the extent we can continue to break down barriers, work together on economic issues, a bit like the United States, we can find common ground. And that's bringing back prosperity to Northern Ireland, bringing back investment. President Biden's special envoy, hopefully he'll appoint soon, would focus on investment and trade. That's a unifying factor for everyone. All families want their kids to get jobs and want to be able to support their families. So let's focus on the bread and butter issues in Northern Ireland. John Hume used to say, you can't eat a flag. And people of Derry certainly knew poverty and Catholic community in general. Here's an opportunity to move forward and to gain the support of people in the middle ground who would say, I don't care if you're Protestant or Catholic or nationalist or unionist, I just want a better life. And I just want my economic problems solved. Tell me how you're going to do that.
So before we move on, I just want to get your take on the big question that always revolves around the Northern Ireland versus Republican Ireland divide. Obviously, Sinn Féin, as one of their top priorities, want to hold a vote on the status of the border and the division between the two political entities. How likely do you think that vote is? What do you think the likely timing is? Or isn't it even realistic that it would happen in the next 10 years?
Well, Sinn Féin should be careful what they wish for, and maybe they're aware of this. London gets the choice of when to put out a referendum based on is there likely a majority in favour of United Ireland. As you said from the polling, if there was a vote now, it possibly could be lost in Northern Ireland in favour of United Ireland, and a lot of people in the south, without thinking about it very much, would vote in favour. So then you'd be putting it off for many more years. So an early vote could be a disaster. A vote without knowing what they're voting for could be a disaster, just as it was with Brexit. So a lot of careful preparation needs to be done. And frankly, reconciliation needs to take place in Northern Ireland as much as it does across the island. And we need a lot more connections between North and South. I think the Shared Island Initiative by the Irish government, by Micheál Martin and Leo Varadkar, is a beginning. It's a very good beginning. It needs to be built on. We need connected railroads. We need connected healthcare. We need telecom. There just needs to be a lot more cooperation, which, of course, was stunted for many, many years by partition. How many people in the South really know the North, drive up and down, have friends, have relatives? Not a lot do. So having much more contact and interaction will, I think, break down the barriers. And eventually, I'm hopeful, like many people are, that an agreed Ireland would emerge. And I put the emphasis on an agreed Ireland, because the last thing we want is for the tyranny of the majority under unionism to become the tyranny of the majority under nationalism. We just need agreement going forward. And of course, a small group of people cannot veto what the overwhelming majority want. But let's try and get together and make an agreed Ireland.
Just one final thought on this discussion. I often, when I talk to people about the conflict in Northern Ireland and the fragile peace, refer to the fact that the unionist majority, then majority in Northern Ireland, had a genuine and reasonable fear that if Ireland originally back in the 1920s had become a wholly independent island, that they would be subjected to Rome rule, which was the term used then. And of course, what we see emerging in Irish history for the first 50 or 60 years of the state is a state which is dominated to an extraordinary level by the Catholic Church. From a Protestant perspective, I would have seen that as confirmation of a legitimate fear. But now, Ireland seems to have changed into an extraordinarily secular state. Is that recognized by the unionist, let's say more conservative unionist elements? Is that chipping away at some of that, monolithic rigidity?
I think there's still a lingering bias about the old Ireland in the north, and it comes down to the lack of connection, lack of interaction that I talked about earlier. People just need to be exposed more. And yes, Ireland is progressive, secular state, liberal, probably too liberal for some conservative Protestant groups who are against gay rights or against gay marriage. So that's ironically doesn't necessarily attract them. But yes, there was a dominant Catholic Church in the old days in Ireland, and people were a lot more religious than they are today. So today it's more about economic issues. I think cultural issues still sort of stand out a bit, but let's hope that the barriers can continue to come down. Now, we've talked about education. The hope was integrated education would bring people together. That hasn't happened in Northern Ireland. Even the sports are segregated to some extent. People play Gaelic games or they play rugby or cricket. So the chances of interaction within Northern Ireland and North and South between the different communities is still limited. We still have the peace walls in Belfast. You still have a very divided society. So a lot of work needs to be done. But certainly anybody who looks around would say, gosh, Ireland as a European member state in the South seems to be a happy place. It seems to be a diverse place. It seems to be prosperous. What's wrong with a greater partnership with that part of the world? And at the same time, Britain is facing immense issues. And what happens in Scotland is going to be of enormous import. If Scotland does vote for independence and then wants to get back inside the European Union, I think that could have a lot of influence on people who feel membership of the European Union is essential for prosperity, and Brexit was a major mistake.
Given the limited time, I don't think we can delve into Brexit in any great detail. And truly, I don't believe we'll fully understand the implications of Brexit for 10 or 15 or 20 years. At this point, it feels to me like it's been greatly clouded by the complications of COVID. But what I would like to talk about before I let you go in a little broader an area is the state of Western democracy, especially in mainland Europe. So things that jump to mind to me is the rather recent disturbing Reichsbürger planned coup in Germany, the election of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, the leader of the Brothers of Italy party. Is Western democracy in trouble? Do these instabilities presage deeper problems?
Hmm. Democracy is always under threat. In history, if you go back, there's always attempts to overthrow it by special interests. And sometimes this feels like Europe in the 1930s with a lot of fascist leanings that have to be countered. So every day, yeah, we fight for democracy. But I mean, look at the hopeful signs. Here we were in America. It seemed like we stood on the edge of a precipice, election deniers and so forth, and America stepped back. America largely voted for democracy. Yes, Italy voted the other way with Meloni, and that's concerning. But the Putin invasion of Ukraine united Europe in an ironic way much more than has been in the last 20 years. Europe has united, making sacrifices to support Ukraine. NATO has come together in a way which it hasn't been for many years. So I think democracy has stepped up. And you have, I think, leaders like Macron in particular of France who are setting an example of why democracy is important, why it should be supported. I lived in Portugal as a diplomat in 1975 when the communists took over, and America wrote it off, Kissinger wrote it off as gone communist. And we thought Italy would go communist as well. Those were interesting days. That threat was defeated and pushed back. So now we're facing a threat from the right, and Hungary included. So these threats always have to be confronted. People have to come together and say that messy as it is, tough as it is, democracy is the best way forward, and we should avoid extremes.
So I'm going to probe a little bit more here. The emergence of the far right, especially in Western Europe and in the United States, and I would say also in Britain, didn't happen. There's a cause and there's an effect. Where did the governing powers at the time fall down that enabled the emergence of far right politics?
I think the biggest failure was free trade, which was supported by middle left wing parties, right wing parties. Democrats became big supporters of it. Certainly, in retrospect, Clinton's support for NAFTA was a major mistake. It hollowed out the middle classes. and parties became enamored of a certain section of the economy winning out. In Britain, it was the whole southeast, the financial service industry. It became fashionable to say you don't need manufacturing anymore, you just become a service sector. That turned out not to be true. We do need manufacturing, both for economic prosperity, but also for strategic security. We can't be depending on chip supply from China. China takes over Taiwan. So we need to make stuff at home for strategic and for economic reasons. And we forgot that for many years, since the 80s. I think we're learning that again. There's a thing called friendshoring and home shoring. America's bringing more jobs home, and they're willing to leave jobs in places like Ireland, which are friendly, called friendshoring, but they're taking jobs back from China and from other parts of the world which don't compete fairly. So this is a new phenomenon. It's wrongly defined as populism. I think it's just responsiveness to your own people's needs. And that's what democracy is meant to do. It's meant to be responsive. It's meant to solve people's problems. And for many years, it made the problems worse.
It's interesting that you talk about the whole issue of free trade. Anytime I hear somebody trotting that out, I usually respond with free for who?
Right.
Which I think is the important question to ask. But I also find it somewhat ironic and amusing that you are basically acknowledging one of the most successful elements of the Donald Trump platform, because indeed this was central to what he ran on. How do you feel about that?
Well, Trump ran on many good ideas, but many of the times it was just a false promise, which is sometimes what populist politicians do in order to get the votes to say, I'm going to be looking out for you, the working class, middle class people. The most important thing he did when he got into office was give a $2 trillion tax break to rich elements, rich companies, rich individuals. And talk about not worrying about the deficit, he just ran the deficit right up. So he promised things, but he had no intention of delivering on them. That's the difference. I'm hopeful that Democrats, and Biden has certainly proved that in his first 2 years, you promise you're going to do stuff for the middle class and the working class people, and then you do it. Look at labor unions, a major factor in gaining a decent standard of living for working people. The Republican Party's position is to oppose them with so-called right-to-work legislation. Biden and the Democrats support them. So by their works shall ye know them, and not by their promises or by their words. So yes, Trump got elected because he said the right things. He was defeated after 4 years because it was clear he wasn't delivering. And it's going to come down to that. And so again, voters will say, are you helping me or are you hindering me? And yes, some of them will get distracted by guns and by religion, but most of the time, people will vote their economic issues.
So, one final thought before we wrap this up. I noticed in the past year, Sweden had an election. And when we think about Swedish democracy, we think of it as having probably the most robust social services sector out of most of the Western democracies. And yet, they opted for a stronger representation by far right-wing parties. So in that case, we've got a government maybe that's a little more predisposed to the needs of its people, and yet it still is opting or swinging more to the right. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I'm not an expert in Sweden, but again, they took in a lot of migrants and didn't make provision for the communities to support them. It's easy at central level to say, okay, we're going to put all these people into your town, but we're not going to give you extra money for special ed teachers. We're not going to give you money to build houses for them, to accommodate them. And if we do, we're going to push aside the people who are on the waiting list already. That's not good politics. It's not fair to society. If you're going to bring people in, you need to accommodate them and look after them and make sure that they can become a good part of the community. I think some of the Swedish liberals forgot that. And again, it comes back to what are ordinary people concerned about, and are you working to solve their problems?
So I've asked a lot of questions. Is there something that I should have asked at this point that you think is pertinent to our listeners looking forward to 2023?
I'm going to ask you, and of course, when this comes out in January, it will be already decided, but who's going to win the World Cup on Sunday? Argentina or France?
I always root to some degree for the underdog. And I think in this case, Argentina is the underdog. And I'm reminded that Argentina is the largest non English speaking member of the Irish diaspora. And indeed, one of their main players, a gentleman by the last name of McAllister, is from Donabate, which is the town next door to where I grew up in Malahide. So I'm rooting for Argentina. France won 4 years ago. I think it's time to give another country a chance.
Hey, I'm with you on that, Martin. Viva Argentina.
So with that, Ted, I'd like to thank you for taking the time. I think we covered an awful lot of territory. We live in interesting times, to use the old Chinese curse. There's a lot that's going to happen in the upcoming year, and we can't honestly predict how things are going to pan out. We just have to be hopeful. I do see reasons to be hopeful for democracy as a general matter, but I always appreciate the opportunity to bounce ideas off you and to hear your thoughts on this. You bring a kind of a unique perspective, both an American and Irish perspective, that I think is really valuable to our listeners. And look forward to doing this again the next time we come to another major crossroads. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I too am inclined to be optimistic. Why not? It's the best motivation in life, gets you up in the morning. And thanks again for having me on this fabulous podcast, and look forward to catching up with you again.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.